Hello everyone, how you guys doing? Hopefully you're having a wonderful day, and today we're here with a video comparing pre-boom pricing for all-time greats and all-time great soccer cards to the current pricing we have in 2024. So, pretty simple premise, but for those that are unaware, basically 2016, 2017, 2018, 2019, the 2010s era, basically soccer cards were an afterthought in the greater landscape of sports cards in general. Sports cards also, in totality, weren't having the boom that they ended up having in the 2020s, early 2020s. So we've come a long way, especially in terms of soccer. A lot of people have sort of found their space over here. And I would say in terms of total collector percentage increase, soccer's done pretty well compared to other sports, aided considerably by how little people were here prior. But now in 2024, the sort of a hunter-gatherer species at this point, a lot of people learning, getting a lay of the land, and starting to figure out where they have to sort of take their place. So we've come a long way. By no means are we some, massive sports cards segment. We're still sort of an afterthought, but at least on a bigger scale. But I want to see sort of how far we've come, especially on some of these key cards. So this is going to be far from perfect. There's one card per player because honestly, a lot of these players, they don't have tons of cards that we're selling and have available data pre-boom, so you can only compare really a couple cards per player. And I don't want to go through 2 or 3 different cards and spend all that time. It's a lot of work, but a lot of this is hard to read at best anyways. There are low volumes of sales, especially pre-2020, so you're not getting consistent numbers. And there's also missing comps. Some players just don't have comps for certain grades, so you can't really compare back and forth. I had to leave out Miazza from this list entirely because I couldn't really find any data pre-boom on his pricing. So by no means perfect, so don't take this as gospel, but I do think it's going to be a fun sort of thought exercise to be able to see, how far these players have come. We're going to look primarily at rookies because it's pretty universal, and those cards were cared about pre-boom, so there's sales for a lot of them. With that said, we start with a George Best here. So we have a PSA 6 of his Barrett from 1964. Pre-boom, this was $462, which is pretty respectable pre-boom. I mean, that's a pretty decent price compared to what we'll see today. Now it is currently $32.40, at least as of the last sale. So that is up 600% for George Best. A pretty decent number, as we'll come to see. We are going to do the top 20 players, so George Best is number 20 on this list. Don't debate the list, that's not the point. I guess if you want to, you can. But we'll keep it moving. Maldini, for him, we have a $78 sale of this Panini Calciatore PSA 8 from 2019. Currently sitting at $312, so Maldini, or at least for this card in this grade, is up 300%. Next up, we have Xavi. For his Monday Chromo PSA 9, this was a $20.5 card in 2017, so a little earlier than some of the other dates, but it wasn't, substantially more in 2019. And in 2024, it is currently worth $180, so that is up 780%. Zico's a tough one, so basically for him, the only thing I could really get sales of earlier, at least something I could get sales of earlier and get now, is this 1976 Saravan. The issue here is that basically pre-2020, especially, this happens for some players, but especially for Zico, there were more issues found before 76, so eventually the goalposts sort of move in terms of rookie. I'll talk more about that in a second. But this item pre-boom was worth $90 in 2019 and currently sits at $50 on the last best offer. So this is down 40%, which is pretty significant, of course. I do some rounding on these, so, not exact, but it is what it is. Nonetheless, that isn't necessarily representative of Zico as a player and in terms of, what people are willing to spend. So I did go ahead and take a peek at what was the highest sale I could find pre-boom, and it was this Ping Pong from 1978, really high grade, sold for $170, and the highest sale that I found since the boom, or at least in the last year or two, was this 2023 March comp for $4,000 on this 1971 Zaeta. All that to say, there are more eyeballs and more money around Zico, just not necessarily on the same items, which is a risk in general in soccer, that eventually people move to different things or find new things out there. That's always sort of something you have to be, somewhat deliberate with and concerned about in terms of, who's most likely to have that. Brazil was one of these areas that still had yet to be explored. Nonetheless, Zico, still performing okay, I would say, in the greater landscape. But next we have Bobby Charlton. So this is 1958 A&BC footballers. This is a blue and red back, since this is what I was able to find pre-boom, in a 4-5 grade. So I will say that this most recent comp is a 4-5 grade. The actual comp that we got back in 2017 was a PSA 4. So it's a half grade difference, which I sort of accounted for in the percentage. It would have been a bit higher, but I rolled it down a bit. So I smudged the numbers here, but up 460%. I tried to do my best with the comps that I was given, but, still a pretty decent number, I would say, for Charlton. Not staggering, but it's still solid. Then we have Van Basten, his 1982-83 football here. A pretty coveted sticker even back in the day. This was going for $312 pre-boom in a PSA 2, and currently the last one went for $1,000 on a fixed price sale in February. So that is up 220%. Not a crazy number considering, how much hobby lore this sticker has, but I also don't see a ton of people collecting exclusively Van Basten. He sort of isn't old enough for vintage, but also isn't new enough for pre-modern in a sense. So I think it's sort of this forgotten era that people don't care as intensely about, but maybe that's a mistake and something that will change over time. It's yet to be decided, of course. For Zidane, we have his Panini foot in a PSA 6. The pre-boom sale we're using is an October 2019 auction that went for $220. The most recent PSA 6 sold for $2,200, so a pretty sizable increase there of 890% on a Zidane. Eusebio here, we have his 1963 Panini Calciatore in a PSA 3, a blue name with a blank back. Not the best example, I would say, here on this 3, so maybe it might be a little light just because of that. It's very off-centered with rounded corners, but it's a 3. Nonetheless, the early sale in 2019 goes for $86. This card that you see, sticker you see on the right, now sells for $228 in January of this year. Net up 165%, which is pretty low, I would say, generally speaking. Granted, Eusebio does have a lot of rare and desirable earlier stickers that probably take up people's minds, but this still is one of the most memorable Panini Calciatore stickers, at least in my mind. Next we have Platini. This is a 1974 issue of him out of France. This in a PSA 5 was sold in 2019 for $480. I sort of smudged the numbers there because there were actually 2 comps and there was a sizable difference, so I just went ahead and put halfway between both and went with $480. The same thing sort of happened recently, and I did the same exact thing where I took the average of both comps, and that came out to $475. So this is one that is actually down, despite the card itself not really changing in any way. Again, sticker, not card, but I use the words interchangeably. Anyways, this is still his rookie sticker, but the one thing is there have been a lot more higher grades coming out. Some of this is due to negligence by PSA. You can clearly see some of these are removed and their backs are sort of torn up, but nonetheless, they still get graded as if their backs weren't torn up. Beyond that, there are also good removals, at least to my eye, that seem to be happening. Like there's some where it's hard to tell if it's a removed copy or not, and so it's just a blurry situation, which I think is why this one has been hit so heavily. I will say beyond that, though, I don't see tons of, Platini-only collectors out there. I'm sure they exist, maybe not in the realms that I'm looking, but I just don't see it. Again, sort of the 70s, 80s, where not quite vintage, but not quite pre-modern. So again, I think that's sort of the forgotten era, at least for this moment in time. Next, we have Jared Muller, a Bergman 1965 issue here in a PSA 6. So pre-boom, this had sold for $88 in 2019. More recently, it sold for $840 in January of this year, which is a pretty sizable increase, net being an 850% increase overall. If I had to speculate why this is so high, I would say that it is because sort of these higher grades in vintage have gotten a lot more of a boost in premium than the lower grades. Like I'd imagine a PSA 2 of his pre-boom was probably selling for like, $20, and now it might sell for like 80, 60, 80, I don't know. I'm sort of speculating on those, but all to say that if you take it in account in lower grades, it's not going to be as high. In the higher grades, you typically get a more prominent increase. So again, not perfect. I think that sort of explains what's going on here. But that's not to say that, it's correct or incorrect. Who knows if the grading premiums on high grade sticks, grows more, lessens. I mean, it's to be decided, of course. Beyond that, we have a Grincha from 1957. This isn't his rookie, but it's still an early Grincha. Also not all that common, and there was a pretty good comp pre-boom that I was able to use. So pre-boom, this had sold for $146 in a PSA 1. More recently, it had sold for 720 in April of this year. So overall, that's a 390% increase. So, probably middle of the road in terms of what we've seen overall. Puskás here, I have his Heinerlei in a PSA 6. One of the more notable cards, I would say, for Puskás, or at least one that sticks out to my mind. He also has early stuff that's kind of rare, so that really isn't comparable, so we had to get a card that's somewhat plentiful. Anywho, the price originally in 2019 was $118 for this PSA 6, and the most recent sale came in at $666 just a month ago. So, net, that is a 460% increase for Puskás. For Beckenbauer here, we have a PSA 5 of his Bergman, so just a one grade lower issue of the same exact version from the molar. In 2018, this was going for around $230. As of late, the last comp is $537. Now, this is pretty staggering in comparison to the Gerd Molar. If I had to explain it in some sort of a way, I would say that these sort of have the same issue that the Platini has earlier, that some of these are removed but still graded really high. I'm guessing that last PSA 5 that comped was probably a PSA 1 or a PSA 2, so people aren't willing to pay that premium. But you do run into the issue that people then see that comp and think that comp's the legitimate comp, and that's sort of a question to be had and how that plays out. I'll say that this is a significantly different number to that we saw of the Gerd Molar, so comparatively, it seems like Beckenbauer might be more of a steal. Also keep in mind that the PSA 5, PSA 6s we've been seeing on these Bergmans back in their day were some of the highest graded ones out there. Now there's 7s, 8s, maybe even 9s, so it's a little bit different of a landscape at this point, but that's what's happened as time's gone on. Then we have Cruyff here. We have his 1968 Palarex in a PSA 2. In terms of the 2019 price, in January it was $552. Currently, the last PSA 2 sold for $1,500, so ultimately that is a 170% increase, which, for one of the best players of all time, is not all that impressive, I would say, at least compared to what we've seen so far. Especially this being, at least in my opinion, the best looking of his rookies. I don't even really think it's close. Now, there is a 1967-68 that is a panel, but people have their own opinions on it. Nonetheless, this Palarex isn't doing all that crazy in terms of percentage gain from pre-boom to now. Now, obviously, it was a pretty respected item pre-boom. I mean, $552, like we were saying before, in a sort of prehistoric era, is a decent number in regard to soccer at that time. So, next we have Cristiano Ronaldo, a 2002 Panini sticker here in a PSA 9. Pre-boom in December of 2019, this had sold for $355. Now, the last sale for this PSA 9 was in 2023, so maybe it's down a bit since then, but there's currently one on auction on PWCC, and it looks like it's going to go for between 4 and 5K, who knows, but nonetheless, that means that this is up nearly 1,300%, so this is the highest, at least that we've seen so far, if you're not including the Zico, which I don't think is an accurate comparison. The Zico we talked about earlier, how people are spending 20 times what they used to spend on certain things. If I had to take a guess why this is up at 1,300%, I would say that it's probably because this is still a really high grade of the sticker and they're not very easy to grade. I will say that if it weren't for fakes from BGS, this number would be a lot higher, which would be really, really staggering. But we saw earlier with the Zico that people were willing to spend almost 20 to 25 times more on some of his highest end stuff. And with someone like a Ronaldo or a Messi that has a similarly drastic multiple on it, right? Back in the day, people were spending, 5, 10K maybe at the most on some Messi cards, and now we see them go for hundreds of thousands. So that's a 50, 60, 70x multiple in terms of what people are spending on the highest of levels. So when you get to some of the highest of the early rookie items, you're going to see pretty staggering numbers in terms of percentage increase. This being pretty staggering, but not as staggering as it could be if you really ramped it up. I don't think it'd be fair, but again, this sort of goes back to how this isn't a perfect system, but it does show that Ronaldo's gotten a lot of love since the boom, which seems pretty fair. Back before there weren't many people in here, there's probably too many Ronaldo cards to really be desirable by the masses. Now there's so many people and so many people going after so many different cards that they can kind of take their place. Then we have a 1977 football Maradona disc in a PSA 1. This went for $350 in March of 2019. The most recent sale was for $1,440 in June of this year, just a few weeks back. And that leaves us with a 310% increase on Maradona, which is fair, not drastic, but fair. Keep in mind, again, this is a low grade, this is a PSA 1, so if you went towards the higher scale of this in like PSA 5, 6, or 7s, you'd get a much higher multiple up into the double digit in terms of hundreds of percent. So you'd be into the thousands. And so it does depend on what you compare in terms of comps, but this was something that was comparable pre-boom. You can't really find much for like 5s and 6s pre-boom. Then we get to Pele. This one was tricky in terms of which item to choose for him. I picked the Aquarella, considering I didn't think that it had a major narrative shift from pre-boom to now. It's still kind of coveted, but it's not necessarily the top of the top in terms of Pele stuff. There haven't really been any date changes, and so I'd say it's more consistent than others. This PSA 2 had sold in December of 2019 for $390, and the last sale in May of this year came in at $1,500. In total, a 280% difference between pre-boom to now. Again, you can make the same sort of conclusion that in higher grades this would have been more excessive, but PSA 2 is somewhat common, so it's sort of a bit lower. And then for Messi, of course, no other card to choose from than the PSA 7 here of his 71 bis. Pre-boom coming in at $620 and currently at closer to $4,900, up around 700% on this card. Pretty decent percentage considering that this is a somewhat available card in terms of Grail-esque cards. This isn't a Grail in terms of rarity, but it is a Grail in terms of iconic nature within soccer and also sort of being the go-to rookie for Messi rookies. Carries a lot of weight, also looks amazing, of course, but nearly 700% up on this over the span of 4 to 5 years is fairly impressive, I would say, especially when compared to other rookies that we saw within this list. So hopefully you enjoyed. I thought it was really fun to be able to go through all these and sort of see where they played out. At least in my mind, they all kind of made sense, at least to what I've been seeing. You know, some of the players you would think that have a lot of buzz, like a Messi, like a Ronaldo, they certainly do. Some of the, goats that aren't as talked about, like say a Cruyff here, not being as high, sort of makes sense to me, at least in my head, in terms of what I've been seeing. So this was very fun from my perspective. Let me know what you thought in terms of players that sold high, low, whatever it may be. But yeah, hopefully you enjoyed. If you did, again, make sure to leave a like. Would love to hear your thoughts down below. And if you want to see more videos like this as soon as I go live, make sure to subscribe. But with that said, hopefully you have a wonderful day, and peace.